Hey, what's up, everybody? It's me, Danae, and I'm here with a message for you. What's going on, beautiful people? It is, let's see, definitely Thursday. I know that much is true. Well, let's see, what's the date today? April 23rd, 2026. Ooh, 3:33 on the clock. And I'm here with the Game of Thrones cards, so you know what time it is. I said in my message on Monday, I believe it was, that I felt, or Tuesday, one of them, that I felt drawn to use these cards, but I was gonna hold off until another day, and I guess, today is the day. So here we go. Let's see what we got today. Gotta pull up nice and snug to the table for these cards. Whoop! Of course, Ten of Swords, traitor. Well, we know that's the moment when Jon Snow was betrayed by the Night's Watch, by the brothers of the Night's Watch, because he advocated for the wildlings and let the wildlings pass through, and that was a big no-no at that time. So they labeled him a traitor, lured him into an ambush because they knew nobody could take him one-on-one, or if he was, on guard or had his defenses up. They lured him in and literally stabbed him in the back and everywhere else. But yeah, so that's the Ten of Swords, some really dismal ending. But the other side of that, of course, is that he was resurrected. But at this point, this was like a season finale where you didn't know what was going to happen. It looked pretty bleak for the main character. Let's see what else. Seven of Swords. Seven of Swords. That's like, oh, yikes. That's a double down on that in the traditional deck. Now this is Samwell Tully, who's not a sinister character at all. He was definitely one of the more honorable characters, but in this picture, he was actually, I remember this, he was actually stealing, more or less, the Valyrian steel sword that was being passed down that had been passed down to generations in his family. He came from a family of warriors, but he himself really didn't have the knack for being a soldier, not in the way that his brother and his father and the men before him did. He was more intellectual, and ended up being a warrior in different ways, and was actually the first to slay a White Walker in the series, to have that firsthand encounter. So he was, but he wasn't in the traditional sense, which is kind of the same for Jon Snow. Like, he was a great and powerful leader, but there were things around his persona that were questionable, mainly the fact that he was supposed to be a bastard. So these two kind of bonded on their on the point of rejection, from the norms of society, from the conventions of their family lives. They weren't really accepted or respected, quite honestly. And here we have the Seven of Swords, which of course in the traditional deck is that deception card most of the time. In this case, he is being deceptive because his father didn't think he was worthy of being passed down the sword. He really just disrespected his poor son because he just didn't think he lived up to his standards. But this was a point where he took that, it's almost like he took his birthright into his own hands, even against the agreement or allowance. Like he didn't wait for it to be passed on to him in the traditional sense that it typically would have been, because if he would have waited for that, he probably never would have got it. So it's something here about like somebody kind of taking their fate into their own hands, and he was motivated to do that to kind of protect his legacy, which was his new partner and her baby that he kind of took on as his child too, where he knew he needed some protection, and he needed to, I feel like it was more of an emblem of confidence and security, because in the end, I think he ended up giving it to somebody, not John, but he gave it to somebody because he couldn't even really manage it. It was too heavy for him in the end. But it was something about kind of like taking back his power in that moment from his father, who had just kind of like beat him down all his life, told him that he wasn't going to amount to much, and then shipped him off to Castle Black, probably hoping that he'd turn up dead or just get out of his hair or something. I don't know. But either way, it's like he took his power back in this moment. And it kind of does give way to almost a resurrection of sorts here, between the Ten of Swords and the Seven, where, like I said, like where he came back home and was hoping to receive, after time had passed, like a warm homecoming, and it was just the same, if not worse, as it had always been, at least from his father, who was the one he really craved validation from in the first place. So, and then of course the brothers of the Night's Watch, and what they did to John was heart-wrenching for him, because he was deeply devoted to the brotherhood. He took his oath very seriously, and he took his brotherhood very seriously. So to have been taken out like that was more gut-wrenching to his soul and his spirit, even after he was resurrected, than it was actually to his body. He had the scar that remained after he was resurrected, but it really did a number on his psyche, because to him, that was the one place where he thought he had, kind of proven himself to be of value. Same thing, like looking for validation, looking for acceptance, for approval, for their worth, for their worth to be substantiated. And that's the place where he thought he found it, only to be literally cut down, to his death. So it's something here about like a really deep cutting, betrayal that was really meant for someone not to get up from. Like it was really meant for them to meet their demise, or be, their ultimate termination or their ultimate defeat. Yet in the stories that are here, that these depictions project, that was the very opposite. If anything, it was almost like the beginning of their stories. After these tragic moments is when they really kind of regenerated and thrived in their fullest potential. Nine of Swords. So much swords, my goodness. Nine of Swords is, what's Nine of Swords? Oh yeah, that's like, so yeah, this could even be kind of like the aftermath, or the PTSD that one kind of has to overcome when going through such a traumatic experience, like the people closest to you betraying you, or the ones you love, or the ones that you trust the most, or that you thought had your best interest at heart, that you thought were in your corner, that you thought you were binded to by oath or by commitment, or you know, maybe even association. The Nine of Swords is like kind of waking up, like a rude awakening, I would say, in this case, like kind of seeing the reality, that like the naked truth or the ugly truth, so to speak. But even more so, like the Knight of Swords speaks more about being almost anxious, or in some cases maybe paranoid for what's to come. Could even be, in this case, still having to manage that feeling of anxiety of having this thing happen again, like trusting, making yourself vulnerable in a way that would leave you open to attack, putting your trust in people, you know, in an intimate way. Could be relationship, you know, vulnerability, or not, is it vulnerability? Intimacy, I guess. He has kind of vulnerability too. Definitely emphasis on vulnerability. And because there's so much sword energy, I would say mentally and maybe even psychological vulnerability, even more so than the physical aspect of kind of building a barrier or a healthy, I just heard fortress, but what I really mean is like boundaries, like setting firm boundaries, particularly on account of something unfavorable that's happened to you, like a betrayal, you know, like almost finding your peace in solitude, or just with the boundaries that make you less vulnerable and certainly less dependent to relationships or on relationships or the ebbs and flows of relationships. So you might be in one, or in an association or some type of communal dynamic, but you don't allow yourself to be but so vulnerable or dependent in that regard, because you have, unfortunately, the memory of what, you know, the worst that could happen when you let your guard down. The Nine of Swords is still someone kind of being a bit worked up in that regard, like, you know, maybe a little too thoughtful, maybe too in their head, or overthinking a great deal, with, you know, with reason, you know, justification for it, but still it speaks to somebody that's considering an outcome that hasn't happened yet. So you're finding yourself in new spaces and places, perhaps, or with an opportunity or even an invitation to be in communion with others or in connection to others again, but all you can think about is what happened before or last time, and how you can not have that happen again, or what you can do this time to, you know, protect yourself. Now, in the best case scenario, it can just be a matter of discernment so you don't repeat a cycle. But usually the Nine of Swords has a bit more of a negative inflection than that. To me, it airs more on the paranoia and the anxiety of what hasn't happened, and what you may not even have any proof for the future, even if you have a point of reference from the past. What that doesn't necessarily equate to what is absolute ahead of you. So sometimes you can kind of like, you know, keep like mentally entrap yourself from what could be a positive experience if you're solely measuring it on what you know, what the past yielded, you know. So anyway, let's say Nine of Cups. Yeah, I love this. Here, saying, well, again, and look at him. Look, he's so much fresher here. This is when he actually had come into his own, you know, like he came into his own. He was, had become a Meister, like a wise, I don't know exactly what they were. I call them the wise men. They were kind of like the wise men, the wizards, the priests, the Yeah, like they were kind of a mix of all the things, but basically they were like the keeper of um of history, of knowledge. They were like the gatekeepers in a sense, actually. Not so, it kind of was a gatekeeping position because you had to, I forget the actual track that you needed to be on to become one, but I know that Samuel was not on track for that. He kind of fell into the position, um, like failed forward into it because he wasn't so great at being a knight that he kind of started hanging around the Meister at the at Castle Black, and ultimately learned that that was actually his calling, and he kind of had to force himself almost into the citadel where the Meisters would train and learn and stuff like that, like almost like the, what do you call it, the spot in Rome that you, like you would equate it to, um what's the place in Rome where the Pope lives? I can't think of the name. But it was kind of like that in a sense. But there were like, you know, it was like a school of wise men there, and like some of the oldest that were just constantly bookkeeping, record keeping, writing down their findings, keeping record of every marriage that ever took place, which was a key factor in this whole series in the end. And remedies for certain ailments and plagues and like everything that you could possibly need to reference, you know, for some point of enlightenment or understanding. The Meisters were the gatekeepers of that information, and they used it to serve ultimately. So anyway, this is him in all his glory in the Nine of Cups, like finally coming to terms with who he was born to be, not necessarily who he was bred to be, but who he was born to be. And how, interestingly enough, who he was bred to be somehow aligned as well, even though it didn't seem to conventionally. Because at heart, he was just as much of a warrior as anyone in his lineage, even more so, because he was far more intellectual in his craft than he was active, you know. Um, and there's so many ways, like if you know the story, I probably definitely, you know, if you know the series, I probably don't need to be saying all the ins and outs, but I'm speaking on it to channel what's being said here also. So I hope that that gets picked up. Not so much just retelling the series, but these are points of the card that matter in this message. So again, this is someone coming into their own after maybe having been betrayed, maybe even betraying themselves, like making agreement with the rejection of society or of their upbringing or whatever, like falling into alignment with that to some degree, to the point where it could have caused anxiety about the future and what the future holds and how you might find a place within it. And then here we go, 9-9 also could be significant, where you finally find your footing. And it might be a little bit of that, a little bit of what you thought was you know, was out of the cards for you, but it's also a nuance of something that maybe perhaps no one in your legacy or in your lineage was on track for before. You know, like someone here is changing the course of history for their legacy, like the trajectory of their legacy in a way that was resisted before. And had you made agreement fully and completely and just almost like surrendered even to that resistance, you might never reach your peak, or might not have ever reached your peak. Yeah. And that Nine of Cups is a place that no one can no one can give you that feeling of supreme self-esteem. It can't even come through validation. Like if he had done everything the way that his father had wanted him to do and got that good old pat on the back like his brother did, more or less, it still wouldn't have cured that need for security deep within his soul, and his spirit wouldn't have been satisfied by that, because that ultimately wasn't the path for him, no matter how forced he could have tried to make it fit. And in the end, his brother and his dad actually got killed by the dragons, like literally got burned alive, smoked, so that could have been his fate, and it wasn't, so it just really paints a picture of the disparity between doing what is expected of you, maybe even what is commanded or demanded of you, and doing what you truly feel guided to do, organically, even when everything in your life that you deem is important or valuable is pushing back against that, or pushing back against you. In some ways, looking to outright stop you completely from achieving this presence here in the Nine of Cups, where you could be fully content with yourself, living on your own terms, doing what makes you happy, moving in the ways that bring you joy and exude confidence, and most times in the ways that are quite contrary to the status quo, so I don't know. Yeah, let's see. That, to me, like, that's the triumph here, all in just a few cards, is to get to that point and be able to maintain that posture where you don't need any external validation, and you don't necessarily, like, the Nine of Cups trumps the Nine of Swords because it makes you more trustworthy of you and your own skin, regardless of what the circumstances or the variables around you are. It kind of gets you out of that sense of insecurity or anxiety and paranoia at its worst, because you trust you so much, your choices, your discernment, your perception, your instincts. There's so much trust in yourself at the Nine of Cups, really and truly, that there's not a lot of room to be anxious about what could come against you, or what could be a threat per se. That could be most intimately speaking or most generally speaking, because that you know how to handle yourself no matter. And that was the thing about Sam. Like he in every difficult situation he faced, for his father to have kind of always degraded him as weak and worthless, he was one of the most triumphant characters throughout the entire series. It was just not something that his father ever truly got to witness, and not in the way that his father would have probably taken notice anyway. If he even, even if he was privy to the perspective, he probably still wouldn't have seen it that way, because his father's idea of strength and honor was in the conventions of war, being a soldier, drawing your sword. Sam couldn't even damn hold the sword. It was too heavy. But what his father and his brother couldn't do is, and what they never did, was fight a White Walker. His father and his brother never had to find a cure for a disease that was deadly, You know, like he cured one of the most pivotal characters in the series from, I forget, it was some type of like not a plague, but it was, what was it called, like the dead man something grayscale or something like that. I forget what it's called, where if you got touched by these particular entities in this particular place, it would eventually like consume your whole body, you know, like to the point where it would eventually like almost make you a zombie in a sense. And nobody else could find a cure for that. And he found a revolutionary practice, had the guts to try it, even in the even against the wishes and the commands of his authority at the Citadel. He tried it anyway, and it was a success. And also, you know, that's how things become revolutionary, or people even become revolutionary, when you do the thing that nobody would dare to do, and even sometimes that you are warned not to do. It becomes a success, and all of a sudden now it's a way of life, you know, where that became a cure for something that was just fatal once upon a time. And what else did he do? Oh, he was the one that figured out that the best weapon against the White Walkers, which were the actual zombie army at the time, was dragon glass or obsidian. And also told them where to find it, you know, where they could mine it at in exuberance. So it's like the things that he was scorned for in some ways may have been resonant, but the some of the things that he was a trailblazer for, his father, his brother, never could have imagined, you know, meeting that type of feat and actually surmounting it. And those are the things, that's the way that you have to ultimately find encouragement for yourself, you know, when you are a particular trailblazer. And that doesn't have to be in any practically profound way per se, like finding a cure for something. Maybe it is, but it could really just be in how you carry yourself, and the self-esteem that you do manage to curate in the midst of great resistance and even offense in many ways. Like all the pushback in the world still can't manage to knock you off of your high horse, at least not for dead. You know, that you always manage to pick yourself up and figure out a new way to reinvent or reemerge even better. Like that is trailblazer energy right there. And it's the stuff, that's the stuff that that massive evolutions are made of, all originating from one single man or woman. You know, it only takes one man or woman to spark a revolution such as this that would ultimately end up changing the whole course of creation. So just keep doing what you're doing. Look at this, Wheel of Fortune. Oh my God, that's so affirmative here. Evolution, change, fate, revolution. Because this is even like the depiction, from what I remember, is like all the houses, you know, or all the major powers of that time that kind of made up the world, you know, or the world of Game of Thrones anyway. And, you know, as we know in the traditional deck, that wheel just keeps on turning. And one of the things that the Daenerys she wanted to do was break the wheel. She didn't want to reinvent it. She didn't want to necessarily, She wasn't necessarily interested in conquering it, in her purest consciousness. She wasn't. She really just wanted to break the cycle, to break the and more so like the reoccurring cycle of just one more power that, may or may not mean any more good than the other, just pushing its way to the top continuously. But there's no regeneration or cycling of fresh energy, like again, of revolutionary energy. It's just the same old, being regenerated time after time, timeline after timeline, generation after generation, and so on and so forth. That was something that she wanted to discontinue altogether. At least that's what she thought. But in the grand scheme of things, she was a part of that will, and there wasn't much that there. Although she could be a new iteration of the origins from which she came, it was virtually impossible to destroy it altogether, because even she being a part of it was just looking to kind of stake her claim on the top of it. You know what I mean? Like nobly and consciously, of course, she led with there not being a dominance as it was in the past, but subconsciously, which ultimately bubbled to the top, she just saw herself as being the better option to be on top, to be the one to kind of rule the course of creation at that time by by leading in a more diplomatic way. But it was still just a recreation of more of the same, in a sense, just in a different package. And maybe that speaks to the fact that the will can never really truly be broken. The best that maybe can be done, I don't know, maybe I'm speaking out of turn with this, but maybe the best that can be done is to innovate, to innovate when you have the power and the position and the influence to do so, is to innovate and influence a change that like I was saying about Sam, that does change the course of the trajectory as it was towards something a bit more favorable, hopefully for the good of all. That would be the ideal. And not just what suits you best or what suits your legacy or your house or whatever, in the terms of that time. More practically and presently, what suits your needs, your viewpoint, your security, your comfort, your skewed perspective. It's really, doing what's in your power to, of course, put yourself in a favorable position, but not without consideration that there are other perspectives and positions that exist and deserve to thrive outside of yours, of which you may have no real point of true point of what's the right word, of like what's the word when you relation to, like there may be very little relatability to those that exist outside of your scope, other than just humanity itself. And if that is it, then that is enough, I believe. Let me get some water. But what this Wheel of Fortune is also saying, especially with reference to the traditional, is that fate is going fate regardless. You can get in alignment with it. You can help to advance it, especially when you're in alignment, you can help to advance or accelerate the universal objective at hand. And of course, you can position yourself against it if you so choose to, but fate is going to have its way. The divine, the universe is going to have its say, whether you're on board or whether you're not. And of course, there will always be room for those trailblazers that are going to enhance that trajectory, like I said, in goodwill and good faith, sometimes even by chance, when you didn't even mean to, but you just had a pure heart and perspective about creation overall, like I said, and doing your small part, which ultimately can amount to be something big and something major when it's in alignment with what the divine is already trying to do. So I feel like those are the folks that are really finding themselves in favor with favor, in this present moment. Like when your views, your perspective, your ambitions are in alignment with what is on trend universally right now, which is unity, harmony, balance, fairness, even all of that also being exhibited through your own uniqueness, and a very much so live and let live mentality for the greatest good of all. That's the type of energy, really playing, reaching for your north node presence and essence, and in this breath of life, reaching to that highest height of supreme self that you can aspire to. The universe can get behind that. The universe can advance that, enhance that, accelerate it, and then put it on display as, propaganda for others to be inspired by. Yeah, that's the Wheel of Fortune. And like I said, I forgot, I didn't even see the correlation here, but I was saying like that's the biggest win, to be at the point of the Nine of Cups where you got your own rhythm, you know yourself, you accept yourself, you love yourself, your light and your shadow. You know how you found balance with all of it. You know how to incorporate the duality of your nature, the polarities of your nature. And again, for the greatest good of all. And then the Wheel of Fortune pops up, almost like the reward or the response to this presence. The affirmation, the ultimate affirmation, the only validation that you really truly need is to see how your fate does play out on account of the choices and chances that you've taken all along the way or up until that moment. That's what validates everything. That's what'll tell you like, oh yeah, I definitely, it's the thing that'll really say to you, like make you grateful for the choices that you made and for the chances that you took against great odds, for the things that the innovative things that you did that seemed to be, that maybe actually were life-threatening at some point in time. The stance that you took, in the name of your own personal integrity and convictions that could have been quite contrary to the status quo, but you maintained it anyway. Like the Wheel of Fortune is the thing, like that stamp of approval that really, to me, depicts like makes it all worth it type of moment. Yeah, I think I'm gonna get like one more, then I'm gonna call it. It's that irrefutable validation that, as I was saying, it couldn't come from the folks or the places and spaces that you thought should be reflective of it, like your folks, your parents, your friends, your community, your your partner, your spouse, your children, your elders, your upbringing, your circumstances, your environment. Nothing can irrefutably validate you, especially when you're walking the path of a trailblazer, because your life is almost like designed to be contrary to everything that you see around you in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not holistically, like against everything and everybody, because, you know, like Sam, like you pick up, you extract the knowledge, you know, where you can. At one point in time, he was literally emptying the bedpans, is what they were equivalent to, the chamber pots of the meisters. Like he was humbled to the lowest of the low grunt work, but he also found keys of information by being subjected to such low vibrational training, you know, so it seemed. That's where he actually found some of his keys, you know, to unlock information, or literally unlock reserves of knowledge and books in places that were off limits to him before, especially if he had never bombarded his way into the Citadel, because he made agreement with the fact that that wasn't a place where he would be accepted, or that wasn't the track that was set before him, you know. So it's like, if you had allowed all the things, you know, that were supposed to derail you from your true purpose to do their job, then you would have never got to do yours, you know. But you didn't. Somebody didn't here. The Wheel of Fortune is confirmation that somebody has persevered against all obstacles, every opposition, every naysayer, against being undervalued, underestimated, underwhelmed perhaps at times. Two of Swords, we know what that gives with Arya here. That was her turning point moment right there. Needle, her sword in one hand, and the wooden one that she trained on in the other. And she couldn't see, literally, that was at the point where she lost her sight, before she was, like, kind of through her initiation process of becoming a faceless man, which was an assassin. But it was the most grueling process of her life. She had never been so tried and tested in all her life than in that moment of time, where she literally could have lost her life, like where she had to adapt and evolve, or else, like, literally learn how to defend herself without sight, with no vision, with no, like, had to rely on enhancing other senses to protect herself and ultimately survive. And not even just survive, because there's that part, but it really was almost like a proving herself to herself in a very strange way. Because of course she could have lost her life for sure, but she also, had she quit, she could have stayed blind. It wasn't until she got through that initiation process that she regained her sight again. And then, you know, of course, turned out to be evolved to this, you know, this fierce warrior and assassin that she always wanted to be. But here it is, when she was a little girl, it was not encouraged for women to be fighters. She was supposed to be a lady, and resisted the constraints of that persona and that expectation pretty much all of her life, like almost seemed to have been born to be something different. She certainly wasn't bred to be, not holistically, because she kind of had to fight against the norm of what her sister was doing and what her mom was exemplifying to kind of run with the boys, so to speak. But there really wasn't a place made for women to be warriors. And the only one example she saw was Brienne of Tarth, who of course was a phenomenon in her own right as well, and took a lot of shit for it. Never quite got the respect. They wouldn't even knight her. She was one of the best knights in all of the land, and she couldn't get knighted until the damn end of the series. Like, so it's like, you fight for your spot, but the validation doesn't come by way of what, usually by the terms that you're fighting against whole time. It's much more internal than that, and usually you're on track for something that there really isn't much of a point of reference for, or very the points of reference are sparse. This literally is like being born to be a trailblazer or a revolutionary. These are the characters that we're speaking of here. It's like the road less traveled for those, like when you are born to change maybe the course of history or the trajectory of time, or the evolution of humanity, maybe just even consciously or creatively. Your path is not really going to look like anything that you could refer to exactly or identically. And part of the struggle is finding your own personal security with that, which usually doesn't come until you're far down that path, have met hella resistance before you realize that this is just the way it was always supposed to be, or the way it was destined to be for me, And usually I would say, this is interesting because, like, those that are in the thick of it, you spend most of your time either trying to readjust or conform, or again, just to survive, just to get by without getting knocked down, trying to toe the line of convention so that you don't do too much and find yourself completely on the outs. And then it usually is some dramatic experience where you realize your craving for validation or acceptance was never really going to be satisfied in the ways that you were after it, or conditioned to believe it should come. And usually you've taken so much damage before that moment of realization, where you can just be happy with who you are and content with, your presence and the value of what you have to offer this world, that sometimes it may actually jade the immersion of it all, like you being fully immersed in the fortune of that great favor, because it certainly is. And the interesting part that I was hearing is, like, that's why it's so important for trailblazers, revolutionaries, to pay that forward to their legacy. Like that's the great challenge, like, say, even millennials have, not to just single out one particular generation, but I can relate obviously to that generation the most, to break the molds and the shackles and the chains that we had to find our way out of, mentally, psychologically, spiritually, some in some ways physically, financially, emotionally, like all of the constraints that we were conditioned to believe were normal, even though we knew that they weren't. Like we could see the handwriting on the wall, even if we couldn't necessarily read it fully. And sometimes it wasn't necessarily clearly legible, but we could see that there was something to be perceived, of the future, that our presence needed to be drawn to, needed to come to full attention to. And hopefully and thankfully, myself, uh, proclaimed personally to shave that learning curve for my child, so that he doesn't have to grow up unlearning as much, because maybe there's still some things I'm passing down, I'm sure, unconsciously. But he doesn't have to unlearn so much or fight through so much to just be himself naturally, as I had to unlearn and grow out of and recondition and decondition and reimagine and confront and release. And it's the cycle, of evolution, of creation and humanity, that some parts are quite natural, and it'll just keep going on and on, passing on one to the other, maybe evolving much more slowly than would be truly prosperous, on account of less folks being awakened or enlightened enough to see how, again, to get in alignment with the flow to help advance where the divine was going anyway, where humanity was being guided to anyway. A lot of the regression and like the stagnancy of growth and advancement is on account of us still cycling through conditionings that are outdated, and it's hard to release because you've been told that this is the way, this is the path, this is what is acceptable. And of course the opposite is not. Whatever we're look at her with two swords, whatever we're even talking about here. But if we can get ahead of the curve, ahead of the game, and still in alignment with the divine, and in so much as what we can see, in our perspective, which may even be skewed to some extent, it still would help out the process, instead of being a resistance to the change and the transition and the unfolding as it would naturally be. You start to, move in that rhythm, and ultimately the wheel can't help but turn. Most likely, if not at a faster pace or rate than it would have been on track to do, certainly not at a delayed one, which I believe is a lot of what we've been experiencing collectively. Just a whole lot of delays and detours and resistances, and that may or may not have been holistically in alignment with divine order. And a lot of that is being cleansed and purged. People that have been perpetuating those delays and detours are being cleansed and purged. And what gets to be left are those that have the will and the ability to perceive the future from the present, and make agreement and covenant with those two, at least be in devotion to doing your part in the presence to have a much brighter future. If not for you, then certainly for the legacy to follow you. Let me get one more and then I'm done. So we're breaking those chains of those confinements of the past. Like, you can't do this, you should only do that, only this is acceptable. And it's still happening. Like, we're still breaking the molds more and more every day, breaking the wheels in our lives, or at least innovating them. But I think what gets passed down to the next generation, the younger ones, your children, are just what's left behind, you know, to reference. Maybe even, I almost said reverence, but reverence or reference, even when you're not here anymore, is what could make all the difference. Is what will make all the difference. There's just certain things that my son just will never have to worry about. There's some things that he'll never have to manage in his life that I did. There's some things he'll never have to overcome, even though it made me a better person, or at least I believe so in many ways. It doesn't mean that has to be where he finds his strength, you know. Seven of Cups. Oh, look at that. And that's Bran. I never saw this card before. That's Bran. Also, look at the eyes. It's something about vision here, perspective. We had a lot of swords, which could definitely be communication, but it can also be vision at times, like to be able to see, you know, to have an idea, to have a perspective, to have a point of view. Certainly heavy on telepathy or discernment or something like that too, with the cups and the swords here. So it's about seeing beyond the optical, particularly here with the seven, the optical illusion, right? Beyond the choices that are set in front of you, that you're told are limited. Like, this is all you got. We know Bran, you know, the character, he ultimately became the ruler of the seven kingdoms at the end of the series. And he was like the embodiment of all the knowledge of creation. And of course, he went through a great trial and tribulation to come to that realization of identity as well. But it was like he was the keeper of the past, the present, and the future. And it was, and he kind of like proved his trustworthiness of that right through his righteousness. You know, like, it was something pure about Bran that more or less kind of like anointed him to be the keeper of that knowledge, having been tried and tested and proven to be trustworthy with it, you know. And a lot of what happened throughout the series, but also just in life, especially considering the trailblazers of creation, is the trial and tribulation does kind of prove your trustworthiness, not your worthiness, because you could be worthy and still not be trustworthy, because the trustworthy aspect comes on account of you recognizing and accepting your worthiness, Nine of Cups, in the first place, again, because there's so many things that are just set up to tell you that you're not. in close proximity and on the larger scheme, like everything, the systems and um and standards, and what do you call it, the establishment overall, whether we're talking about this fictitious one or in real life, is set up to reflect to you that you're only worth but so much, or reflect some limitation of value. And when you can break through that illusion and still have your integrity intact, still have, a determination established through your pure identity and purpose, still, even after being affirmed in some way, again, circle back around to the integrity piece where you didn't allow the ego of it all to trump the to trump your honor, or the honor in your duty, or the honor of your service. All of that kind of rolls up into the trustworthy aspect, where what you thought was the reward, even just at the 9, you couldn't even imagine like how much more expansive or magnificent it could get beyond that. But you're about to find out. Like I said before, with this Wheel of Fortune, it's like it all makes sense. It's all worth it. Like a full circle moment finally coming to pass, where you know without a shadow of a doubt that it couldn't have been any other way. And now you have, with the 7 of Cups, like you have, like I was saying before about the 9, and then getting the 9 of Swords, but then getting to the 9 of Cups. When at the 7, it's like anything could be, or even with the 2, you could have very little visibility and have hell of potential options, some of which may be pitfalls and some of which may be prosperous. All of that ahead of you, and you could still trust yourself with yourself because you've been tried and true to do so at this point. Like your discernment is top tier, your perspective is pure, your passion is pure, your intentions are organic. Like everything about you is whole, whole enough, at least in this stage in your life, to literally be able to discern between any array of options or paths or choices or invitations or propositions, people, places, like anything that sets itself in front of you or that comes across your path can be clearly discerned even with your eyes closed at this point, because you've been conditioned to operate in that high level of in such a high frequency, a high functioning frequency. Yeah, somebody's discernment and instincts and maybe even their intuition is like top notch at this. If it's not the best it's ever going to be, it's certainly the best it's ever been. So again, you can trust yourself with yourself. Wow. The 4 of Spears, which is the 4 of Wands. Like, this is a great accomplishment, an achievement, something noteworthy, something celebratory. Like, it's literally like crossing the threshold of some more fulfilling existence of life. Like the worst that you could possibly have experienced in this lifetime being behind you, but it being everything that kind of led you to this presence, like this existence of balance and harmony and peace. A strong foundation of faith is what's been established here. With the moon. Ooh. And this is so mystical. What's that? I'm just curious. The Five of Swords. Oh, that was when they were trying to take over Winterfell, or they did. They seized Winterfell. But it's like, it's so mystical here. The emergence of you, maybe even the evolution of you, because it's something that happened in plain sight, but behind the veil at the same time. Like, it's given very much so like overnight success, so it seems, but which we know is never ever the case. Because what the general public, the world, the masses, whomever is, spectating this so-called overnight success perceives to be so, usually was someone in the trenches for years, or working hard for a long time, or in one particular way, or dedicated, committed to that particular thing, or something in that vein, for it to finally have this moment of reveal, But to everyone else, it's like, oh, where did they come from, or who is that, or when did they get on the scene, or whatever. But for you, for the person that relates to this anyway, you've been through the trenches, getting it out the mud, literally, when no one would even know where to find you or where to look. They didn't even know that you might have you even still existed. Like Arya, she was pretty much written off for dead for the most part, because nobody had seen or heard from her since she ran off to pretty much find safety. Same for Bran, as a matter of fact. They kind of disappeared from common existence throughout the series, but the whole time they were being groomed. They were being grown. They were being trained. They were evolving. Their true identities were emerging. Same for even Sam and Jon. They were sent off to Castle Black, where ultimately you were to live out your days of service until death. Nobody expected to hear from you, especially not like I said, common society, your family, your friends. Like, you were really almost like, what do they call it, exiling yourself, or being exiled in some cases. Jon volunteered, Sam was sent, but some criminals, that was like a punishment, to be exiled to Castle Black, never to be seen again. But lo and behold, for Spears, it's like emerging, like a rose from the concrete, literally emerging from the dead, literally, in some ways, where you were completely written off, forgotten about, disregarded, discarded, left for dead, considered you'd never advance again, or never be better, never come back in any considerable form of success or of value again. Even if you were still alive, you'd never be as good as you were before, or as pretty as you were before, or as popular or successful, or whatever, like completely just written off. And then all of a sudden, in what seems like a blink of an eye, or out of nowhere, or when it was least expected, and maybe in some obscure place or way that still no one necessarily even needs to see or will get to see. But this doesn't mean that this isn't still existing with the Four of Spirits. So meaning you could be somewhere, as I'm, speaking of being seen and spectated, like you could be living a beautiful, quiet life somewhere, secluded or off, out of public eye, off of social media, off the radar. And it's just as valuable, if not even more so, and certainly more sacred and protected than it would be to live it out loud or for everyone to see. Because the conditioning, here it is again, of society is that if it's not posted or if it's not lived in a public sense, if it's not publicized, then it's not real. It doesn't exist. But that couldn't be less true. I was watching a clip of some girl, some poor little white girl, made some type of clip about schooling millennials about the etiquettes of social media, like what's cringe, what's in, what's on trend, what's not, like trying to get us together, And it's so funny, like I was watching the clip of all the responses of people, millennials kind of putting her in her place, like, girl, like, don't you know we were here when social media was born? We are the guinea pigs, we are the ones that gave life to this thing that you covet and praise, and reverence so dearly. So you ain't never gonna school us. You can have your standards and your preferences and live by them and so be it, but you ain't never going to tell us how we need to fall in line. Like, no, that's never going to happen. And I'm saying that to say that we are the generation that knows life before social media, at the emergence, the dawn of social media and everything else, internet, all of that. And then, of course, we see the aftermath, what it ultimately, like the good, the bad, and the indifferent of what it has become, and ultimately what it can be or has yet to be, i.e. AI, and the pros and cons of that. So it's like the whole scope is our perspective because we lived through it, firsthand experience. So we know very much so how to survive without a cell phone, even though you rather not. How to take breaks off of social media, even if you never have, since it's been around. You know how to live a life that is not immediately publicized and still be fully content and fulfilled in that regard. And that's something that these newer generations will never have the privilege of, unfortunately, in some ways. There will always be an influence that would intrude, even if you tried to impose that experience onto them. It's just around. It's here, But yeah, so anyway, all that to say is that could be you. And don't be afraid to let it be you. Don't be afraid to build your life in solitude, maybe even in secret, if that's what you're into or whatever, or in a way, or just being even more selective about what you share, really sacred life. That's what I'm trying to get to, like having a sacred life is indeed worth living. It doesn't have to be a publicly social one. And it'll probably, I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to let you go, as we would say on our landlines, that since I've been off of Instagram. I never really was much for Twitter, certainly not after it became X, but Instagram and Facebook and stuff like that. Now, I had a Black Planet page, okay? I had a MySpace. I had Facebook when it was just for college students and you had to have a college email to get on. So, freshman year, that was me in my dorm, jumping on Facebook with everybody else. But now, having disconnected myself from those spaces, I don't miss it. I never felt so much relief from not being so overly connected and exposed as I was when I was heavily in those spaces. And there's nothing really about it that I think about day to day that inspires me to want to reconnect again. So I don't know if I ever will. If I do, it'll probably be professionally more than it would be personally and socially. But personally, I don't miss it at all. There are certain anxieties that come along with those spaces that just are not natural. So if that's life holistically, or that's the ideal life for someone holistically, don't be afraid, because that's kind of a trailblazer act at this time, given the world that we're in. But don't be afraid to let that be your normal, with no apologies or regrets or remorse about it. You ain't missing nothing. I could tell you that firsthand. You ain't missing a damn thing. All right, so I believe that there. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Until next time, as always, I leave you with peace.